National Endowment for the Humanities is a longtime supporter and frequent partner of National History Day. Over the years, NEH and NHD have collaborated on a number of projects, including the development of History Day materials found on EdCitement, NEH's online platform for K-12 humanities teaching resources, and in this Ask an NEH Expert video series, where we seek advice from NEH grant winners in educational and cultural institutions all around the country, asking these history professionals to speak about some of the skills they use every day, the same skills needed for a successful History Day project.
We know that language has power, and we're talking more and more about the kind of power that language has in the world, in classrooms, in personal interactions. And there have been many moments when I've seen people or communities become riled up by a use or misuse of language. Of course, in the United States, and so oftentimes when we hear about these incidents focused on a single word, it may turn out that there's something deeper that's been going on, and that momentary use of the word indicates a longer pattern of something. Not always, but sometimes that is the case.
A really powerful example of language having power was in the aftermath of a major hurricane in the early 2000s, and everyone in New Orleans was really struggling to find food. There was two newspaper pictures. One showed a young Black man carrying groceries away from a grocery store and described him as a looter. Another showed a white couple carrying groceries away from a grocery store and said they were carrying food, right? This is an example where language is perpetuating stereotypes, associating African Americans with being criminals, when we see the exact same behavior, people surviving a storm, being described in two very different ways. Well, the first thing, if you're looking to find out how a group describes themselves, the first thing to remember is that that may have changed over time, especially when you're doing historical work. You may find that the term that was considered very respectful and particularly favored by a group in the past is no longer the terminology that's now outdated. So, for example, the terminology of respect being used to refer to African Americans used to be Negro, right? That term is now considered outdated, although you will still find it in organizational names that were organizations founded in earlier historic periods, in which case it's absolutely fine to use that term in the name of an organization that exists. But if you're looking for how a group today seeks to describe themselves, you might look at, you might find websites that are created by members of that group, particularly political organizations that explain why they favor particular language. This is particularly the case, I think, with Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, whether folks want to be referred to by what that terminology is, Indian, Native American, Indigenous, or particularly perhaps a tribal name, so Lenape or something like that.
If you're not sure that a term is offensive in the present day, the first thing to do is to do a little research. One of my favorite research possibilities, which is now available online, research sources, is the Oxford English Dictionary, which presents you with a history of all of these words. And it's actually a fascinating thing to look at. And it's often available online via libraries. And it'll give you the origin story as best we know it and the different ways that it's been used. So that's a very old, classic way to figure out what a term means. And they do try to update it and bring it down to the present day.
One of the things that can be really challenging about historical writing is that you want to respect your sources. Your sources are your evidence, and the language in those sources can be really important and can tell us a lot about the past.
I would not encourage us to edit those primary sources. One famous example of this with the WPA narratives, we know that those who took oral histories and transcribed those oral histories put them into this really awful, sometimes dialect, a terrible, horrible misrepresentation of Southern Black people's speech. And historians have sometimes wondered, should we edit this back and take out what is clearly racist at some point? The ways in which these transcripts were transcribed. These recordings were transcribed. Most historians, though, have decided just to leave it as is, as troublesome as it is, because once we enter in with our 21st century sensibilities, what are we possibly obscuring about the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, about the intent of the interviewee, even if the interviewer is messing with that intent? You just are creating another layer possibly of confusion. And so I think it's important to, even if you have to represent and explain that, which is what many historians do, that these sources, the context within which these sources were created and why they're so troublesome, but what we can get out of it, that's the better way to go, rather than editing them to conform to our sense of what they should be. To the young historians who are maybe doing research on their own or with a mentor for the first time and coming across documents with words that make us uncomfortable, that are words that we would not want to say in public, but that are integral. We need to know that they existed and were used in order to understand the historical moment. I would say take note of them, of those words, think about what they indicate, and think about how you want to use them in your research and writing. Sometimes you don't have to say everything that you find in order to make the point you need to make, but sometimes it's important to say, this is what this historical actor said. Sometimes what that historical actor says is important to indicate just how bad things were for some people, or to indicate what they were thinking at that moment. And it's a privilege to enter into archives and to engage with people. You will meet people in your research on the best days of their lives and some of them on the worst days of their lives. And we should really hold a kind of grace for them, regardless of where they stand in that moment. We only see them in that snapshot in terms of our research, and they are hopefully serving a larger purpose for us. But just to be considerate both of the historical actors and also of your future audience. And in terms of your future audience, think about how you best want to make an argument and what will keep your future audience with you as you make that argument versus what might push them away. And bringing those sets of ideas together, you can present even the most difficult material with sensitivity and with respect for historical actors, for history, and for those who want to read your work.